Okay, it looks like we're live. We'll get started here. Hello, all, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I am excited to be moderating this discussion around navigating the path to surgeon-centric surgery centers. My name is Bruce Johnstone. I'm one of the partners here at Apex Design Build, and I am joined by two brilliant panelists, Chris Newland and Brett Maxfield. Both of them have tremendous amount of experience in surgery centers, and they'll be sharing that experience with us today. Let's get started with some introductions. Brett, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate that. My name is Brett Maxfield. I am the president and CEO of Maxfield Healthcare Solutions. A little bit of my background. I have a background in anesthesia. I'm a nurse anesthesiologist. Have been since 2009. Worked in several hospitals, a lot of office-based practices. In 2015, I transitioned away from anesthesia and started consulting, and we now work internationally, nationally, and internationally, helping build office-based surgical practices, building anesthesia practices for office procedures, and then ambulatory surgery centers. I own a multi-specialty center in Idaho, and I'm partners in another. Currently, I serve as the Director of Surgical Services and Anesthesia for Teton Valley Hospital, which is a little critical access hospital in Driggs, Idaho. So that's kind of my background. Thanks, Bruce.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Over to you, Chris.
Hi, my name's Chris Newland. I'm a healthcare lawyer and lobbyist based in Jacksonville, Florida. Some of you on the call may know me as the general counsel of the Florida Society of Plastic Surgeons and/or the Aesthetic Society, which is a national group of plastic surgeons. I've been dealing mostly with office-based surgery laws, especially in the state of Florida, but also in Oregon and some other places. And because of that, I've had to also learn some ASC laws because we have to know the difference and which works for you. With that, I'll put it back to Bruce and let's get started.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Brett. So the purpose of our discussion is to offer insight and practical guidance to physicians and surgeons who are considering the transition to either office-based surgery or ambulatory surgery centers. As a surgeon, you might recognize the opportunity and the autonomy that comes with having your own surgery center, whether that's improved patient care or more optimal patient experience, or just simply looking to get more authority over your schedules. But the journey to establishing these centers can seem very daunting. All the regulatory complexities and operational hurdles and so on. So we want to demystify that process the best that we can. We want to provide clarity on what your path towards developing a physician-centric surgery center could look like. So we'll be discussing both the office-based environment as well as state licensed facilities through the course of our conversation today. Please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box as we go, and we'll ensure that there's time for any necessary questions at the finish. We plan to wrap this up within 60 minutes. So with that, let's jump in. The first topic that I'd like to cover is kind of an obvious one, and that is just how to determine whether a surgery center makes sense for a physician. In their given scenario, their set of circumstances, what should be considered to make that determination effectively. And I'm sure that both of you would have some input on this. Sort of the starting place, these kind of conversations that we all have with physicians and surgeons. But Brett, maybe you could just kick us off. Just what factors should be considered to inform that decision?
Sure, you bet. So, I've yet to work with a person who a year out after we got it set up and got it going for them, regretted the decision to set up either an office-based surgical practice or an ASC. As we all know, working in the hospital is essential. There's some patients that just flat out can't be done outside the hospital. But outside of that, there's all kinds of benefits, as you mentioned, to being outside the hospital, controlling your own schedule, additional revenue source, ease of scheduling, different things like that. The pandemic for me really brought that to a forefront. Had quite a bit of an uptick in clientele and requests for new builds, just due to the fact that a lot of these people, especially the group that are speaking with us today, plastic surgeons, podiatrists, oral maxillofacial surgeons, they were kind of the first to be pushed out of the hospital as essentially non-essential. And so I saw a big uptick in those guys needing somewhere to be able to operate. So The first factor that I would say is one, the need, is this going to improve your practice? And then the second one is just kind of looking at that, what's the need in the area as far as that goes? Am I going into an inundated area, or am I going somewhere where this is going to be financially beneficial to me? And so, we could spend an hour and a half on all the different factors you want to consider before going into them. But for me, those are two of the biggest ones are, really, what's this going to be to my benefit in the long run? And is there a need if I do this? And Chris, I'm sure you've got a lot more to add.
I agree totally with what Brett said, but there are a couple of other issues that I think you have to consider. One is what you do. And are you doing the type of procedures that require a hospital, or are you doing the type of procedures that can be done in an ASC or an office? And there's a different role. You also have to look at the payer mix. It's very different if you're a plastic surgeon versus a gastroenterologist. And the reason for that is that many procedures get paid on a facility fee. And typically, although not universally, ASCs receive a facility fee on top of your professional fee, whereas office-based surgery typically is not entitled to get a facility fee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that works very well if you're a plastic surgeon and you weren't going to get a facility fee anyway because it's a non-covered service. You can incorporate that. But if you're reliant very much on Medicare and insurance, I'll take a gastroenterologist, for instance, then it really pays to have a facility that you can bill in addition to your professional service.
That's good. Yeah, we'll get in more into the payer mix. I think that's a critical part of this this discussion as we identify, facility types, especially. What about determining whether it's singular or multi-specialty? How does that factor into the determination here? Just sorting out what service lines would potentially be included in the center. Brett, any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this is a big point of discussion we have with a lot of the surgeons that I work with. And it's really important to decide, one, if I want to be multi-specialty or not. And really that comes down to, if I'm a plastic surgeon, I'm looking at it, I go, okay, do I want to share this facility with other specialties? Do I want to have other patients coming in? I worked with a guy one time who had shared an office with a neurosurgery group. And he's like, yeah, it was just a little awkward and uncomfortable for my cosmetic patients to be sitting next to somebody with a halo because they had their cervical spine fused, things like that. So it's important to look at that aspect of what's my goal with this. The revenue generation is definitely better lots of times if you have a multi-specialty group. But what you need to do is look at the cost versus revenue, because sometimes, I'll work with a group that, say, has done plastics. And they'll come to me and say, hey, I was reading in Becker's review that, spine is making all this money and cardiovascular is making all this money. So let's bring some of those specialties in. They do. Those are great specialties for an ASC, but the investment to bring them in is something that has to be factored in. As I was building my multi-specialty center and I went out and recruited additional physicians, I tried to recruit physicians whose equipment, so their instruments, their tools, all that kind of overlapped. So I started with plastics, and then it was a natural progression to get hand, and then hand with small joints. So we got podiatry, and then we were doing a little bit of, body contouring, things like that. So a small amount of GYN and general surgery made sense because those instrument sets overlapped to where we weren't investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into one specific specialty that was coming on. So it's really important to take into equation what that value is going to bring versus what the cost is going to be. That ROI is huge.
That's good.
What I'd like to add to that is, from a business perspective, obviously, one of the things you do not want is any operating room not being utilized to its fullest. So if you have enough plastic surgery business, whether just for yourself or with a single specialty ASC, that can work very well and everybody's doing the same thing. But if you have open OR space, you got to use that space to make it worthwhile to you. That being said, and I'll get into the weeds just a little bit, there's a thing called the 1/3 rule when it comes to ASCs, and that if you have a multi-specialty group, 1/3 of your income has to come from surgical procedures, and 1/3 of your procedures have to be done in that ASC. So it limits some of your flexibility if you're going to go into a multi-specialty group. And I've actually had physicians who've been kicked out of an ASC because they weren't doing enough business there.
Mhm.
So being a passive physician investor becomes much more difficult, especially if you're in a multi-specialty group.
Mhm.
Yeah, fantastic insight on just that consideration. Specifically on multi-specialty, seeing as we're on that point, maybe you could offer some insight, Chris, around what the syndication process can typically look like when there's a group of physicians, because typically multi-specialty means multi-physicians, right? So that getting those physicians into a center and the legal entity that houses that surgery center, what does that syndication process
Yeah,
typically
it
look like?
becomes absolutely essential to have a good operating agreement. If you have an LLC or bylaws, if you have a corporation that spells out the governance of the institution, how it's going to work, everything down to credentialing, but typically things like ownership and stuff like that, because that's where the issues arise. Is there, for the founder of the group, is there going to be a management fee that will go into that, or are all costs and profits going to be divided equally? Those things have to be decided very, very early. And then once they are, everything should flow pretty easily from that. But again, these are the discussions that you need to have with each other and then with lawyers after or before you actually start investing in those sort of things. Investing and then coming up with these issues is just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, that alignment out the early onset is so critical, but then also just making sure that it's backed up legally with the operation agreements is a really good point.
And I'll defer to Brett on this, but I want to add one other thing. When you're seeking people to go into business with, and this goes to an OSR, ASC, or virtually anything, make sure it's people that you can tolerate.
Mhm.
I've seen several ASC projects go south just because 4 of the owners hated 2 of the owners. And it became personal, but then it became financial, and everybody suffered.
Well, and even on top of that, like I'll take it one step further from that too, Chris. Make sure that while you all tolerate each other well, you also tolerate the partners of those people, the spouses, because that I've seen a couple of ASCs get torn apart by that as well. So make sure that there's compatibility there.
Fair warnings.
Hmm.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to shift to sort of the next phase, you might say, through the journey. Topic being around identifying whether the facility type makes more sense to be state licensed ambulatory surgery center environment, or whether an accredited office-based facility is sufficient. Office-based surgery, office-based lab, and sort of identifying the facility type. We get a lot of these questions from our clients who are in the early sort of phases of trying to pre-plan and understand what makes sense for them. I think we touched on it briefly, and I'd like to expand on it further. The payer mix, whether it's Medicare, whether it's cash pay, whether it's insurance, how that affects the decision. Brett, let's start with your comments on that.
Sure. Yeah, and absolutely. Chris had a great segue into this already as he was talking about it. One of the biggest decision makers between being an office-based surgical practice versus being a full-blown ASC is whether or not you want to collect that facility fee. To have a guarantee to be able to collect that facility fee, it almost always has to be an ambulatory surgery center. You can have, now ambulatory surgery center, when we use that term, sometimes that can mean a whole lot of different things. You can have an ambulatory surgery center that is just a simple OR suite with a recovery room. You have to have a dedicated area for recovery, but it can even be, used for procedures, things like that separately, as long as it's only being used for recovery at the time. That can just be attached to a clinical practice, as that appendage there, as long as all the correct components are in place, as long as it meets those requirements that Medicare has put out to be able to have that Medicare deemed status. So ultimately, that's what it comes back to, is you've got to look at it and say, okay, what's my clientele? What's my payer mix? If I'm doing a lot of ENT, for example, and I've got a lot of kids and I've got a lot of Medicaid, I'm not going to do an office-based surgery center because I'm not, or an office-based, surgical practice, because my reimbursement from the facility fee is not going to come back to me. I'm not going to collect that. Now, on the flip side, if I'm a plastic surgeon doing cosmetic cases, I'm not going to collect a facility fee from any insurance anyway. So lots of times it doesn't make sense, unless you're going to be in a multi-specialty center, to go that ASC route. It makes more sense to do the ambulatory office-based route, because there's a little bit less investment involved in creating that, a little less managerial need. One of the biggest things between Medicare deemed facilities and office-based practices is that when you're Medicare and you're working with CMS, you have a huge component involved with the emergency response within the community and within the and it honestly, it takes a lot. There's a lot of administrative time that you have to pay an administrator for to manage that federal Medicare Medicaid component, that if you are cosmetic only, you're just doing that out of your office, that is eliminated completely. So that's just one example. There's several other examples, but really ultimately for me, when I'm speaking with somebody, it comes back to that, hey, we may be able to get a facility fee for a commercial payer in an office-based surgical practice, but there's that asterisk. We may be able to, but for sure, Medicare, Medicaid, it's not happening. So if you are taking a large Medicare, Medicaid clientele, it needs to be an ASC. Chris, you kind of started that. I'll kick back to you for that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about dermatology for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Most dermatologists don't want to be in an ASC, but if you're doing Mohs surgery and significant dermatologic surgery, a lot of those people do go into ASCs, but it depends on exactly what are you doing. Are you doing the types of procedures that Medicare is going to pay a facility fee for? That's your best guidepost, because most insurance companies echo what Medicare does. If Medicare will pay for it, most managed care companies will pay for it as well at differing amounts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and just to add to that really quick too, Chris brings up a good point. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't think I ever want Medicare. Medicare doesn't pay, Medicaid doesn't pay, whatever it may be. At my multi-specialty center, interestingly enough, the one procedure that reimbursed the best with the insurer that reimbursed the best was a multiple midfoot fusion or bunion correction paid for by Medicaid. Crazy enough, that was our highest reimbursing single procedure. So sometimes don't just dismiss it right off just because you're saying, oh, it's Medicare, Medicaid. Sometimes it is financially worth it to go that extra step.
So it really just all stems from procedure types and what the reimbursement modeling looks like. Obviously, there's that advantage in the fee, the facility fee collected by a state licensed facility. But I think that really kind of draws our attention to an obvious point of state by state, it can be different, whether it's a certificate of need, a CON state versus a non-CON state, and what it takes, what the process looks like to become licensed in either of those sort of scenarios. Chris, you could probably elaborate on what the immediate differences are between a CON versus a non-CON state and what that process can be to get licensed.
Well, many more states now have regulations as to what an office-based surgery can be. The general rule is you can get an office-based surgery once you have it done. You can probably get accredited or licensed, however they word it, probably in about 30 days. An ASC is more akin to a mini hospital when it comes to getting licensed. Almost universally, an ASC has to be licensed. You don't just register and use. And while you have to have accreditation from, say, the Joint Commission, that alone won't be enough. You're going to have a state inspection. The facility standards are going to be vastly different in an ASC, especially in a state like Florida, where you have to have separate locker rooms for male and female staff. You have to have the dedicated post-operative recovery unit. All of that makes a huge difference. Once you are done with an ASC, it takes up to 6 months to get your license going. Also, with regard to an ASC, I always recommend throwing the design by state regulators before you even start, because one of the worst things that you can do is think that you've got something, build it, and then have, in Florida would be the Agency for Healthcare Administration, come in and say, I'm sorry, the hallways aren't long enough to have a typical medical gurney. You have to have a foot on each side. Those things can't be corrected post-build. So the process is much longer. The facility standards are much larger as well. And the time it takes to create one is, I don't want to say greatly, significantly greater than it is for an office surgery unit.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Chris is saying there. And I routinely am brought on as a consultant after there's been a problem. And just as Chris said, man, sometimes adding an extra 2 inches to 2 feet to a hallway can't be done. Adding another 200 square feet to an operating room sometimes can't be done. So running that by early, past the fire marshals, past the architects, past everybody, really sage advice from Chris.
And I'm just going to double down on that, making sure that people like the fire marshals, who you might not initially think of, make sure that they approve the plans before you go forward. Zoning issues. I know we're going to talk about those, but I've got a good war story. I had a plastic surgeon who had a great office surgery unit, and it was an old Victorian house. It was unique. It was wonderful. But what she did is she wanted to move it to a different, more high-profile area. She paid to have the entire Victorian house with the office surgery unit that had been approved moved to a new location, got it into place, and then discovered that the neighborhood was not zoned for anything medical, and she couldn't use it. Take care of these things ahead of time. We actually did get her a variance, but there was a 6-month lag. But
yeah, well, that's the kind of thing that we can certainly get in front of with early feasibility, planning effort. So yeah, always comes highly recommended to do that before you have that significant expenditure. You touched briefly, Chris, on the accrediting process for more of the office-based scenario being likely 30 days or some more expedited timeline. But can you elaborate just a little bit on what that process might look like to become accredited by one of the accrediting bodies for office-based surgery and or office-based lab?
The 3 biggest accrediting organizations, and they're all very good, are Quad A, SF, AAA, HC, and the Joint Commission, each of whom will accredit office-based units. I know that AAA does not do, Quad A does not do ASCs. They only do office surgery.
I'm actually going to step in and correct you real quick, Chris.
Excuse me?
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you real quick there, Chris. So I am actually a surveyor for Quad A, and we actually do Medicare deemed ASCs now. So I just want to make sure and catch that really quick. So we'll do the dental and the ASC. So just wanted to point that out real quiк. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to catch you off there. Just wanted to figure it out.
Let's get this right. That's the important thing. But each of them, they're going to look at your physical plan standards to a certain extent. They're going to look at your credentialing. I know Quad A is more vigilant than some as far as who can be part of the OSR, who can actually work in it. That's why for board certified plastic surgeons, I think Quad A is the gold standard for just that reason. They're very picky about who they can use. But one of the things that Quad A does that doesn't happen in ASCs is they come in and they do a pre-inspection and they tell you where you're going right, where you're going wrong, and this has got to be fixed before we can give you full accreditation. When it comes to an ASC, and even though you have in most cases, the accreditation by one of these entities, the state is going to come in and look, and they're not going to give you 30 days to fix something. They're going to say, this is right, this is wrong, and they can close you down. So one of the advantages of an OSR is that it is what we call in Florida OSR, is that it's easier to work with the accrediting organizations to get it right, as opposed to the almost high risk inspection you're going to have with an ASC, which is more akin to a hospital inspection, where your very license is at stake. Now, even with an office surgery unit in Florida, for instance, there are now certain things they can come in And if they find or they have a complaint, they can shut you down. But it's not the same as an ASC. And you don't have to have the formal credentialing to the extent you do in an ASC. The transfer agreements tend to be a little bit easier to get than with an ASC. So those are all things that have to be considered when you go through this.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just to piggyback off what you're saying there, Chris, as things are evolving and growing there, we talked a little bit of certificate of need and differences between states. They being with Quad A now does what we call the deemed, which is where they'll come in and they will do, and AAA will do this now as well. They will do the Medicare inspection for the state with their own surveyors. And so you can have that one-stop shop. You have one visit where they come in, they take care of everything for you. And just as you stated, when I go and do an accreditation for an office-based practice, they know I'm coming. They send me a list of, hey, here's the days that we're going to be available for you to come in. Quad A reaches out to me and says, hey, Brett, are you available to schedule for one of these days? I let them know. They let the office know. They coordinate it. And I show up and, hey, Brett, welcome to our office. Thank you for coming. We're glad to see you. We're planning on you here today. When I go and do a Medicare deemed study, so like my facility in Idaho, for example, is a Medicare deemed multi-specialty Quad A facility. We give them a window of 90 days with all of our scheduled cases, and they will then reach out to their deemed accreditors. So like me, for example, I went through some additional training so I can do the Medicare survey for them as well. There's a different survey team that comes out. It's made up of 3 people for Medicare versus typically an office-based, you've got 1. And they will, within that 90-day window, randomly show up one day. And they come, they walk through, they follow a patient the whole way through surgery, they watch our whole process. The life safety inspector sticks his head in your ceiling and checks to make sure that your firewall is correct. It's involved. Versus the survey for the office-based is not quite as involved, but it is still fairly stringent. It does, Chris mentioned the ability to shut you down. They do give us, as office-based inspectors, the ability to submit what's called an immediate jeopardy finding, meaning we're in the office and we see something that's egregious enough that we let Quad A office know and say, hey, look, this is happening, this isn't safe. They reach out and say, hey, we're pulling your accreditation. They won't close your doors, but they'll come in and say, hey, we're pulling your accreditation pending on you fixing this, which is why, kind of circling back to the previous discussion, there are now some of the commercial payers who are willing to give a facility fee to some of these facilities that have been accredited for dental anesthesia, pediatric procedures, OMFS, and plastics, because they now see that these levels are kind of increasing, and they're bringing maybe not to that same standard like Chris pointed out that an ASC would, but to a higher standard than just some random person in a strip mall. The horror stories of the Miami plastic surgeon in their home garage, right? Injecting silicone from Home Depot, right? None of that is going on. And so that it comes back, we've talked a little bit about that certificate of need that Chris mentioned. I'll let Chris talk more to that one. But in some states, that certificate of need is so stringent, Illinois, California, Tennessee, Alaska, just being some of the ones that I've dealt with recently. It's so hard to get that certificate of need that sometimes your only option is to go with that office-based practice where you can have the procedure and then have one of these accrediting agencies come in and say, hey, even though this isn't a true ASC, these guys are legit. They're doing it right. You've got the accreditation, you've got the certification, which they can then take to, obviously not Medicaid and Medicare, but maybe Blue Cross Blue Shield, maybe, some of these others, and say, hey, look, here's the proof. We're doing it right. We would like to be reimbursed. We're cheaper than a hospital. We're cheaper than an ASC. We'll save you money. Come let us play too, kind of thing.
Right.
So, but again, that certificate of need is just onerous. And do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, I will, because I've done quite a bit, mostly with regard to open heart programs. But one of the issues you have in what we call CON states, where you have to apply for a certificate of need, is to show that there's a community need for whatever the type of surgery center you're creating. Mm-hmm. And the problem of doing that is that it is an administrative determination. And the hospital that you're competing with has the ability to oppose you on that certificate of need. Mm-hmm. And what many of these hospitals or other ASCs in the community often do is they realize that you're going to take some of their market share. So if they can delay a CON project for 2 years, and many times they can, that's 2 years of increased profit for them. And they're willing to do that, even if they know they're not going to win in the long run. If they can delay you for 2 years, that's 2 years of additional profit for them. It's worth the attorney fees to keep this project going. Whereas a competitor tends not to have the ability to oppose your office surgery unit. Although on occasion you have confidential complaints, but that's a whole different story. So especially in CON states, the administrative rigmarole that it takes to get up and going can be considerably more.
Yeah, you nailed it perfectly. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that.
That's really good. That clarity helps. I think that really does elaborate on the details that need to be considered when sort of making that decision between facility type. So thanks for that. I'd like to kind of transition more into following that decision. Once we're clear on the facility type, whether it's going to be an ASC, whether it's going to be office-based, accredited, sort of move into then a development phase of really trying to narrow down then the physical plant, all the needs around getting the facility developed. And one of the first things that's obvious that comes up is just determining the location, even proximity to whatever system you might still be affiliated with, or proximity to your target patient base, your current patient base. Accessibility is a factor. There's a variety of things that kind of come into that decision. But Brett, maybe kick us off on this one again. Just some of the things that come top of mind to you when trying to sort out the physical plant location.
Sure, absolutely. And, obviously zoning is a big deal. So Chris has mentioned that. I'll let him talk more about that. For me, let's talk more about the logistics side of things on mine. You're going to be looking at things like, who is your clientele? Like, where's your clientele coming from? Where are they going to be willing to go? If you have a largely Medicare, Medicaid-based population, being closer to home for them is going to be a big thing. It's transportation may be an issue there. So being in proximity, I worked Bruce and I worked together on this project, but we had a project that we were looking at in Florida that was almost 100% Medicaid pediatric dental population, mostly non-English speaking population. And where they had their location, the cost to build the facility was a little bit prohibitive, because once we got it done, it would have been the most expensive facility in the area. But we looked at the accessibility of, okay, if we build this facility in a little bit nicer area, are they still going to be able to have that same clientele? And ultimately, that led to the decision to, hey, we are going to invest a little bit more. Maybe we won't use as much of what we planned on. We won't go quite as high end. But to be able to serve this clientele, we have to be in this area. Versus, on some of our high end cosmetic type stuff, the location matters. They want to be seeing, I'm working on a project that has this big, beautiful view. As the patient wheels into the operating room, they can look out over the entire valley and see, this gorgeous view. They've got these big, beautiful windows that set on a hill. And so, for that high-end clientele that's paying for that boutique experience, for them, that was an important thing. Sometimes you've got clients that, again, same thing, high-end clientele, they come in, and I've had clients before say, hey, people know who I am. Where's my car going to be parked? I have a recognizable car. I have a, this, that, or the other. I'm having, intimate cosmetic surgery done. I don't want people to know that I was here at this facility. How can you? So at that particular facility, I have underground parking where they pull in. It's in a city that's a little distance away from where the majority of these known people are. And so they park in the underground parking at a facility. And when they're given the option to have surgery, there nearby, or at this other facility an hour away, they prefer this facility an hour away because they're not going to run into a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, a coworker, something like that. So it's funny how there's a lot of those different things. Again, accessibility. Really though, that those points are kind of from the logistics standpoint. Leaving out the legal side, that really does factor in a lot. I would also say look at where the area is headed and where it's come from before building, because you don't want to go in and put a nice facility in an area that 5 years from now is going to be, quote unquote, the wrong side of the tracks, where you put this big investment into an area that, rather than being a growing and emerging area, is an area that is receding, going to lose population, going to become less and less safe, and going to decrease the value of your investment over the long term. So I'll kick the rest to Chris. I talked enough about that. Chris, your turn.
Yeah, I have two stories on the opposite ends of the spectrum here. About 15 years ago, I don't know if our audience knows Florida at all. I had a surgeon who was going to invest in an office surgery, in an ASC in Palatka, which at the time was kind of the middle of nowhere. And I told him he was foolish. And he said, no, I'm not, because Flagler County is the biggest growing county in the state of Florida. He has made a mint. He was ahead of the market. He was ahead of where they are. But it goes to Brett's point. You go where the patients are. If you look where office surgery units, registered and licensed office surgery units are in the state of Florida, there are about 480 of them, of which 200 are in Palm Beach and Broward County.
Mm-hmm.
And why? Because that's where people want cosmetic surgery. That's where, in that particular socioeconomic group, they don't care if people know, because they assume that people had work done. But to your point, the offices are absolutely beautiful, and you don't realize that there is surgery being done. And even the operating rooms have gorgeous views of the Intracoastal Waterway and of Palm Beach proper. Understand your clientele, and clientele want certain things. Now, with the pediatric dental, you just had to go where the population was and where you can get it. But the expectations, especially when you're talking about elective surgery, making that facility what the people want is absolutely crucial in the development phase.
That's really good. Do you want to touch, Chris, on the zoning part of that, how that factors into physical location? I mean, obviously, we don't want to make that mistake. So
exactly, and you don't want to make that mistake early on in the game. So as you're in your development plan, you're going to pick a site that you think is okay, but you're also going to want to make sure that you can do everything that you can. I've had ASCs and office surgeries that have gotten the problem. They thought they had the absolute great location, and then the fire marshal comes in and says, your front door isn't wide enough to get a gurney in. We can't allow you to do procedures here because we can't get it in on an emergency basis. Those are the things you got to think about. And they're not sexy items, right? But they're things that have to be considered before you go in and invest a whole lot of money in the construction phase.
Yeah, and things like, what's our backup power? Can we put a generator in this facility? Because we got to have a generator. Do we have to do solar? Do we have to do, another thing too that you really need to look at is, do I own this building or am I leasing it? Because that'll, for me and my clients, I really talk that one up about how much do you want to invest when you're just doing owner improvements at this point, for tax reasons and everything else. Look at it as, okay, I'm going to go in, I want to make this nice. What's available? Some places there's not land to buy. Those facilities, the only option you really have is to lease, do the owner improvements, and just know that, you're paying a lease all the time. On the flip side, hey, if there's land, Idaho is wide open. Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, where I'm at, there's land everywhere. And so here, it doesn't make a lot of sense to lease an area, as long as it's in a good spot where you can go, kind of like your example of the gentleman out in the middle of nowhere. Man, he probably bought it, and now someday when he flips it and sells that, that's his legacy. He's going to have a mountain to live on when he sells that off. So I think that's a really important thing to consider is, when you're considering how much you're going to invest into a facility is, do I own this and am I going to recoup, 80-90% of whatever my investment was or more as it appreciates, or am I leasing this space and am I going to possibly lose the investment that I've put into this if I lose the lease, if the lease changes, if the lease rate goes up, if different things like that, or again, what's the availability? Can I buy space or do I have to lease space to get in the area that I want to be in? Do I have to lease? If I want to be on Rodeo in Beverly Hills, I'm not going to be able to buy anything there. Am I going to have to lease a space? How much do I want to then invest in this leased space? So definitely, again, that goes to what Chris was talking about, the zoning, the permitting, and what is available, whether or not you want to lease or just buy and build.
if you're building, one quick legalism, a lot of practices, especially when it comes to an ASC, obviously, will have a separate LLC or corporation own the land if you are buying, as opposed to the ASC itself, because you can do more than as far as leasing back to the ASC. You have a cash flow that's coming into you that way. And also when it comes to the land, you can have a different sort of investor group. It's very easy to have a real estate venture group come in and say, okay, we'll help you buy the land, but we know nothing about operating an ASC. We're going to leave you to that. And it's an option you have if you separate the land acquisition company from the actual operational ASC.
Yeah, very true. And actually, back to the previous point too, I have been in a couple of situations where just that certificate of need was something that in and of itself, it actually carries a value. And so I was in a situation where in Alaska, there was this facility that I was working with that actually had no real value. The facility itself just was not at all. It was a converted used car dealership, but it had a certificate of need in a state where it's almost impossible to get a certificate of need. So the purchase price or the offering price was based on that certificate of need, not actually on what the physical environment was. So it's something else to keep in mind as you know, if you're able to get that certificate of need, it carries value.
Awesome. That's some really good takeaways on how to go about locating and securing the appropriate location. So thanks for that. I thought it would be helpful as we kind of consider this development phase, just to share some critical pitfalls to be aware of during the development phase. Once you kind of, you know, get past the real estate acquisition and into truly trying to get the facility opened. That's quite the journey in and of itself. For one thing, of course, in our immediate area here in design and construction of these centers, there's multiple approaches to how to go about getting a facility designed and built, whether it's, you know, more of an integrated methodology of one firm handling all the planning and construction phase, whether it's split up between architecture and construction, and really just the means to determining what the best approach is for a given development. You know, each kind of development has its own set of circumstances. But that's just one thing. Another thing that comes to mind is, you know, shareholders, getting input from the key shareholders at the appropriate time to ensure that all the necessary input is there. I'm sure that both of you have, you know, plenty of things you could share around just pitfalls to avoid, some things for takeaways on that. Chris, do you want to kick us off with some thoughts on?
Absolutely. And I have some personal biases here because I've seen some disasters. I don't care if you're dealing with groups as good as Bruce or Brett's, always have at least two entities looking at this, whether it be a compliance officer and the construction people, because the builders don't know the local laws to the extent that the compliance people will, and vice versa. The compliance people don't know what it costs to build something. But having a checks and balance system is absolutely crucial, because I had an entity here in Jacksonville that went and did the construction, and the way they had laid it out, they couldn't abide by the requisite laws. And the building people had said, this is fine. We've checked it out. You're okay. Going to the outside person was absolutely crucial, and they should have done it sooner. So while there are very good construction and planners, that's great, always have at least one other entity looking over the project and just making sure and asking the questions that a single source entity may not be able to ask or doesn't want to ask.
Yeah, Chris makes a really good point. You know, Bruce and I work together on projects for just that reason. You know, I provide kind of a clinical view, while Bruce can provide that architectural and code perspective. So I've reached out to Bruce many times on projects that I usually, I wish it was otherwise, but there have been quite a few times where I get pulled into projects because something is going the wrong way and they've derailed and they need some help. And so that's when I get pulled in. And so lots of times on that stuff, I'll reach out to Bruce and say, hey man, look what's going on here. How do we save this thing? Or something will come from a design group and they're like, look, it all meets code. This is going to be great. And I'll look at it and go, yeah, but your staff are going to have to walk 20 minutes to get to the bathroom, every time they have to leave a patient. It just from a functionality standpoint, maybe doesn't make sense. And so I agree with you completely, Chris, there that, it's a big investment. I mean, right now I'm seeing nationally somewhere between like $650 and $850 on average per square foot to build a surgery center, and that's not even including the equipment that goes inside, which is, somewhere in the neighborhood of like $100,000 per operating room to go in and fully equip one of these things.
Depending on what you're doing there, it may be more if you're doing more complex procedures.
True. Yeah. I mean, you're doing spine, you're looking at $100,000 plus per microscope, and then another $100,000 or so per x-ray. So, I mean, even more equipment wise to your point. So, I mean, it's a big investment. It's one that, you really should be looking at, making sure that from a clinical standpoint, from a code standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, that you're prepared walking into this thing, that you don't go in just, and then legally, making sure anytime I'm on a design, I tell them right off the bat, fire marshal gets involved before we do anything. Architects go through everything before we do anything. I'm going to look this over and tell you why it's not going to work or why it is going to work functionally before we do anything. We spent on that big project I just completed. We did a big 5-OR, basically small surgical hospital. We spent almost a year and a half in the design phase, making sure that everything was done right before we ever broke ground to make sure that it was done correctly. Now, office-based, significantly quicker. If you want to have a quick turnaround, you're like, I need to be operating now. I got pushed out of the hospital. I need to be, I need to have a space to operate as a cosmetic or plastic surgeon. Office-based, quick turnaround, I'm currently working on one that start to finish the project. We're probably gonna be about 3 months. So, and then they'll be set, they'll be ready to go. We sourced everything for them, just boom, 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 got things in order. So there's big variation there between cost, between time frame, between who all needs to be involved. And it really scales with the scale of the project from my experience. I'll kick that kind of back to you, Bruce, because I know that's kind of your realm. You seeing kind of the same thing?
Yeah. Those that input that you've shared on cost is really good. I think what we find just so critical is that there's thorough and accurate calculations on both time and money to help mitigate that risk, because that's it's not only the cost, but a lot of times the timelines that are assumed by groups of how quickly, how optimistically they can get into a space, into a surgery center, and they might have recruiting done based on that. They might have even be starting to schedule cases and so on. But the thing is really to be very calculated in time and money is going to mitigate a lot of risk. And it all feeds into the accuracy of the performa as well, which I was hoping that you could cover, just briefly on that, Brett, how important it is to really have a well-dialed performa. We've kind of gone over the types of cases, the types of specialties, and the case volume and that sort of thing, but how that stacks against the initial cost of investment and how just critical it is to have a well-prepared performa so that going into it, there's really clear return on investment calculated in timelines associated with that. Any comments you want to share around performance specifically, or?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is. It's super important. It's super important that you know the market that you're getting into before you dive in. So you need to look at, first off, this market saturation. What is my revenue going to be? Look at the payer mix. Look and see what that's going to be. Look and see what the demand is going to be. Just like Chris mentioned, Palm Beach, the demand is going to be much higher for plastic surgery than it's going to be in the middle of nowhere, Texas, West Texas, right? Like there's just not going to be that patient population. Look at the overall saturation. How many ASCs are there? How many physicians in your specialty are there? Southeast Idaho, where I'm at, there's more dentists than churches, which is saying a lot because there's a lot of churches too. Okay. But where I trained in Flint, Michigan, there was one pediatric dentist when I was there for the entire city of Flint. By the time I left, there were 2 more, but even still 3 for the entire city of Flint. It was massively underserved. There's a lot of potential revenue that can be gained by spending the money up front and making sure that the specialties you're bringing in, everything you're doing. And again, this is another one that's scaled very much to where an office-based surgical practice, if you're already operating in the area, there's not much risk of that. There's not a whole lot of pro forma needed to be done. You're just going to look at what are my costs right now that I'm dumping into the hospital, paying to rent space versus what I'm going to be saving and possibly generating in my own space. Then you take that and extrapolate that out to something bigger, like one of these big facilities I talked about. You're $10, $13 million into facilities alone in these big facilities and equipment and different things like that. So now you've got to look at, okay, who's my competitors? Am I competing against big hospital chains? Am I competing against other ASCs? How many specialties can I bring on? All that is going to be a component of the pro forma. And so it's important to have somebody who knows what they're doing and who knows the area to be able to come in, do your pro forma, put things together and get you an accurate forecast, kind of your crystal ball, before you start dropping money, start throwing that investment in there. It's worth the investment early on to save the heartache later on.
Really, and I'll only add to that, the pro forma is one of those documents that you need a second set of eyes on.
Mm-hmm.
Don't trust the person who is trying to develop for you and gives you a pro forma that may be completely unrealistic. Show that to somebody else who can tell you that's unrealistic.
Trust but verify. That's good. Mm-hmm. One more question for you, Chris, just before we move on from the development phase, specific to negotiating contracts for insurance contracts. Any differences between office-based versus ASC facilities, or any comments around insurance contract negotiations that you'd like to share?
As we mentioned earlier, most managed care entities will not pay a facility fee for an office-based unit. And the reason they do that is they just tack on Medicare. They say, Medicare doesn't pay for this, we're not going to pay for it. Mm-hmm. That being said, you can, on occasion, if you're doing Mohs surgery is a great example of this. You say, listen, I would otherwise go to an ASC. It's going to cost you a facility fee of $200 for the day. I only want a $100 facility fee, but because I'm going to save you money, but I still want the full professional fee. And sometimes you can say, you're still going to save money on what I otherwise would have to do. You don't want me going to the ASC, but your bargaining position gives me no choice. And sometimes, not always, sometimes a managed care company will look through the absolute rule and say, yeah, it makes sense economically for us to give you a facility fee because we still save money in the long run. Mm-hmm. But that's what you have to convince them of, that by paying you a facility fee for an office-based unit, you are still going to save them money.
Very good. Thanks for that. I realize that we're coming up to our hour here shortly. I want to just touch on a couple of things operationally before we conclude. Just as the facility is open and now operating, some insights I think would be beneficial for the audience, and one specifically is around scheduling. We made the comment earlier about downtime or an operating room not being in use, and I thought it might just help if there was some comments around how scheduling works in either environment, office-based or ASC, and mm-hmm. Just how to run a tight ship with scheduling. Any comments on that, Brett?
Yeah, so there's a big difference between the scheduling between the two and staffing. So typically an office-based practice is staffed with the same staff with maybe one or two additions that your office already is. So that office, the nurse who's assisting you in surgery is also the nurse who's seeing your patients post-operatively on the days that are non-surgical days in an office-based surgery center. Versus in a surgery center, you've got staff that are coming in, they're not associated, they cannot actually be working with the clinic at the same time that they're working with the surgery center. That's actually a delineated standard within Quad A and Medicare. So the surgeons are scheduled in what we call blocks, and most of our audience will be very familiar with that, either half-day blocks or full-day blocks. And block utilization becomes a big component of efficiency and revenue generation within the surgery center. The office-based practice, not as much, again, because you just are changing an office day to a clinical or a surgical day. So like a lot of the office-based practices, what they'll do is on their surgical days, they, again, this is using cosmetics for an example, but the days that their surgeon and nurses are in doing surgery in their procedure room, they are using the patient care rooms for med spa, things like that. So they find alternative use. Versus in a surgery center, if a surgeon's gone, that room's closed. There is no revenue generated that day. And so you have to be very careful about how you are setting up your staffing, how you're setting up, like with my facility, for example, I had 2 ORs. I always tried to maximize those 2 OR days as much as possible with my regular staff. Now, if I had to bring in additional staff to be able to run a second room, I had to equate out what cases we were bringing in, how much of the day we were bringing those cases in for, and what the cost of staffing, materials, things like that were going to be, versus stacking that additional procedure, if there was maybe only one, onto the end of the day and only having one room open. So that's a whole other, hour-long lecture about staffing modalities, staffing intricacies. But ultimately, that block time scheduling becomes really important in the ASC setting in terms of efficiency and cost cutting.
I'm going to give a personal example on this. Even with an ASC, not as much as a hospital, you have to schedule your time ahead of time. And sometimes in an office-based unit, you've got a much more flexibility. A few years ago, I had a problem with my eye, and I went to an ophthalmologist, and I had been told by the optometrist that I was probably going to lose all sight in that eye. The ophthalmologist looked at it, started laughing, yelled out the door, "Can you guys get OR1 ready? I got a patient coming in." And within 5 minutes, I was in their OR, and the guy did the little laser procedure, and I can see 20/40 now out of that eye. That's something that you don't get in an ASC. And this is a place that did most of their procedures in an ASC. Why? Because for cataracts and things like that, they got the facility fee. So those things they did in the ASC.
Yep. Perfect example.
Is there a rule of thumb that applies to the cost of maintaining a facility post-occupancy, whether that's cost per OR or something similar? Is there a benchmark?
Unfortunately, no. There are benchmarks that you can compare to. Just another example, I'm the president of the Idaho Ambulatory Surgery Center Association, which is part of the national ASCA, Ambulatory Surgery Centers of America. So ASCA and IASCA both do their own benchmarking that then you can compare yourself to on all sorts of things from turnover time, costs, revenue based on specialty, revenue based on OR days, OR hours, things like that. The thing there is that there's so much variation from specialty to specialty, from mainly that more than anything else, from specialty to specialty, that sometimes those benchmarking metrics are just a little bit hard to apply if it's not apples to apples. Sometimes you end up apples to pears, and it just doesn't quite end up the same thing.
Fair enough. Yeah. Just know that question often comes our way, and I've kind of struggled with the same thing. There's not a one size fits all on that, but I'd put the question out there. Good. Well, let's just take one question that came into Q&A, and then we'll wrap up here. Question is, what cannot be done in an office-based surgery facility? What cannot be done?
Chris, I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I'll just talk about Florida has some pretty specific stuff, but it's fairly universal. They're saying things that you can't do any procedure that has more than 10% expected blood loss. You can't do neurosurgery in an office. I mean, the typical head stuff, neurological, all of which makes sense. That's got to be done in an ASC or a hospital. An office stuff, it's got to be stuff that doesn't involve major blood vessels. And I'm reading from the Florida law right here. You have to be able to see everything. And generally they're not emergent or life-threatening in nature. Otherwise, you need to be going to a hospital or maybe an ASC. Brett?
And yeah, from a clinical standpoint, the general guideline out there is that if it's a complex procedure, it should be in either a high-level ASC or a hospital. If it's a minor procedure, and now again, these are very nebulous terms.
Yeah.
My general rule of thumb as I'm talking to my clients is, I tell the surgeons, think to yourself, theoretically, could I do this under a local anesthesia if I didn't have an anesthesia provider available? And if the answer is yes, and there are a lot of things, I mean, you could do abdominoplasties under, you can do liposuction, you can do all kinds of things. Would I do a tonsil and adenoid in an office without anesthesia? No. There are some places that maybe do that. That's a little bit more on the complex, should be shifted towards the ASC type side. But just as a general rule of thumb, when I talk with my clients, I tell them, hey, if you think you could do this in the office under local anesthesia, maybe not the most comfortably for the patient, but you could do it theoretically, then it would be fine to do as an office-based procedure.
Very good. I think that addresses that question well, so thanks for that. Just to conclude, any parting words of advice that you both can share with the audience around this topic of ambulatory surgery center versus office-based? And we've covered a lot of ground, but if there's any sage advice you'd like to
make one closing macroeconomic thought here. Having office-based facilities and ASCs available in the community helps everybody, because what we found in Florida, when there was a moratorium on level 3 office surgeries at one point, all of a sudden the hospitals tripled their price for operating room time at the hospital. So to keep an economic balance, it's important for the medical community to have these options at least available in the community.
And my parting words, would just be that sometimes as we're getting going, we don't realize what we don't know. And so there's always, even me, even being a consultant for as many years as I have, I always have my references that I reach out to. Bruce, Chris, and maybe somebody else, that I have those resources available that I can reach out to. So that would be my parting word of advice, is find your resources and use them. It's worth the investment up front to not have the heartache afterwards, like I mentioned before. So reach out to those who have been there and done that already, who can be mentors, who can help you. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't try to come up with everything from scratch. It's out there. There's people like the three of us who are there and available to help you through. Reach out to those people and don't try to go on it. Don't go through the hard time of doing it on your own. You use the resources available to you.
Fully agree. We often say that to potential new clients as well, that the first thing to do is build a team of experts. Surround yourself with folks who've done it a lot of times. It'll save you a tremendous amount of time, headache, and get you in the right course. Thank you both very much for all the insight, all the participation here. Thanks to the audience for joining us. That concludes this session, and we'll be back with you more at another time.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you all.